This is the Nimitz-Class aircraft carrier and the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier. Both are powered by atomic reactors. Both became pride of their country. Aircraft carriers are the ultimate expression of naval power. They're floating cities, air bases, and strategic weapons platforms all rolled into one. But not all carriers are created equal. The United States operates 10 Nimitz-Class supercarriers, each displacing over 100,000 tons. France operates exactly one nuclear carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, at roughly 42,000 tons. Both are nuclear-powered, both launch fighter jets, but the similarities pretty much end there. Let's compare these two engineering marvels across 7 dimensions. Let's start with how long it takes to build these giants. The Nimitz-Class carriers were built at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, the only shipyard in the United States capable of constructing nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. The lead ship, USS Nimitz, took about 5 years from keel laying in June 1968 to commissioning in May 1975. That 7-year span included extensive testing and sea trials. The 10 ships in the class were produced at a steady rhythm of roughly 1 every 3 to 4 years, with each individual ship taking 4 to 5 years of actual construction time. Newport News had been building nuclear carriers since the USS Enterprise in the 1950s. That's decades of institutional knowledge, a specialized workforce, and a supply chain refined over multiple generations of warship construction. When you build the same type of ship repeatedly, you get fast at it. Now, the Charles de Gaulle. Construction began in 1988 at DCN-SAKA Naval Group in Brest, France. The ship was physically launched in May 1994, 6 years after the first steel was cut. But she wasn't commissioned until May 2001. That's 11 years from start to operational status. What happened in between? The program was plagued by delays. Budget constraints forced a 4-year construction pause from 1990 to 1994. The French government simply ran out of allocated funds. Technical problems compounded the schedule. The flight deck had to be lengthened by 4.4 meters after testing revealed it was too short for the E-2C Hawkeye to land safely. The propeller shafts had manufacturing defects. The nuclear reactor shielding required modifications. And throughout the process, France was learning how to build a nuclear surface ship for the very first time. The K-15 reactors were originally designed for submarines, and adapting them to a carrier created engineering challenges nobody had solved before. The difference is stark: 5 years versus 11. But it's not just about time, it's about industrial maturity. The US had been continuously producing nuclear carriers since 1958. France was starting from zero. Every delay on the Charles de Gaulle was the price of acquiring a capability no European nation had ever attempted. The learning curve was steep, expensive, and slow, but it was also necessary. France now possesses the industrial knowledge to build its next-generation carrier, the PANG, scheduled to enter service in the 2030s. The 11-year ordeal of the Charles de Gaulle was, in many ways, an investment in that future capability. Here's where the raw numbers are eye-opening. A late-production Nimitz-Class carrier, specifically USS George H.W. Bush, the 10th and final ship of the class, cost approximately $8.5 billion in then-year dollars when construction wrapped up in 2009. Earlier ships were significantly cheaper. USS Nimitz herself cost around $4.5 billion in adjusted 1970s dollars. As the class matured, each successive ship incorporated new electronics, upgraded combat systems, and enhanced protection features that drove costs steadily upward. Adjusted for inflation to today's money, A Nimitz represents roughly a $10 to $11 billion investment per hull. And that's just the ship. The embarked air wing of 90 aircraft adds another $5 to $6 billion on top. The Charles de Gaulle's total program cost came to approximately 3.3 billion euros, roughly 3.3 billion US dollars at late 1990s exchange rates. That figure includes not just the hull, but the development of the K-15 nuclear reactors, the combat management system, and initial air wing integration. Here's where the comparison gets nuanced. Cost per ton, a standard metric in naval shipbuilding, paints a different picture. The Nimitz displaces about 100,000 tons, giving roughly $85,000 to $100,000 per ton, depending on which ship you measure. The Charles de Gaulle displaces about 42,500 tons, coming in at around $78,000 per ton. The per-ton cost is surprisingly close, but there's a catch. France built exactly one ship in this class, so all the research and development costs, the reactor design, the combat system, the new catapult integration with US-supplied C-13 steam catapults, had to be amortized across a single hull. The US spread its R&D across 10 ships. When you factor in that the Charles de Gaulle program had to absorb all first-of-class costs with no follow-on orders, the efficiency of the French program is actually remarkable. The real difference between $8.5 billion and $3.3 billion isn't cost efficiency, it's ambition. One nation built a global power projection platform capable of dominating any ocean. The other built a regional flagship capable of leading European naval operations. Both got exactly what they paid for. A Nimitz-Class carrier carries a typical carrier air wing of approximately 90 aircraft. That complement breaks down into 4 strike fighter squadrons, usually a mix of Super Hornets and increasingly F-35C Lightning IIS, plus an electronic attack squadron of 18 G Growlers, an airborne early warning squadron of E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes, a helicopter Sea Combat Squadron flying MH-80R Seahawks, a helicopter maritime strike squadron with MH-60S, and a detachment of C-2 Greyhound carrier onboard delivery aircraft. The ship has 3.3 million cubic feet of hangar space spread across 3 decks. In an emergency surge scenario, what the Navy calls maximum density, a Nimitz can physically fit over 130 aircraft on its 4.5-acre flight deck and hangar bays. The limiting factor isn't space, it's the ability to effectively operate, maintain, and arm that many aircraft simultaneously. Now, the Charles de Gaulle. Its air wing, the Groupe Aérien Embarqué, typically consists of 30 to 40 aircraft. The core strike capability comes from 2 or 3 flotillas of Rafale M fighters, totaling 24 to 30 aircraft. These are supplemented by 2 or 3 E-2C Hawkeyes for airborne early warning, and several helicopters for ASW and search and rescue duties. The hangar is significantly smaller, roughly half the Nimitz capacity, but raw aircraft count is only half the story. Sortie rate, how many combat missions you can generate per hour, is the number that wins battles. The Nimitz-Class operates 4 C-13 steam catapults, 2 on the bow and 2 on the waist. In surge mode, each catapult can launch 1 aircraft every 20 to 30 seconds. Doing the math, a Nimitz can theoretically fire off a fully loaded strike fighter every minute. Sustained over 24 hours, that's approximately 120 to 150 sorties per day. In maximum surge conditions, the Nimitz and its crew have demonstrated the ability to launch 60 to 70 aircraft in a single hour. The Charles de Gaulle has 2 US-supplied C-13 catapults, half the Nimitz count, mounted on the bow and the angled deck. Each catapult cycle takes roughly 60 seconds to reset, retension, and position the next aircraft. That yields approximately 60 sorties per day in sustained operations, or 20 to 30 aircraft per hour in surge mode. Bottom line, at peak tempo, the Nimitz generates roughly 3 times the combat sorties of the Charles de Gaulle. 4 catapults versus 2. 90 aircraft versus 40. This isn't just about size, it's about operational philosophy. The U.S. Navy doctrine is built on overwhelming sortie generation. Saturate enemy defenses with volume. The French Navy doctrine is precision-oriented. Fewer aircraft, but each carrying high-end munitions against carefully selected targets. Both approaches work, but they solve fundamentally different problems. Both carriers use nuclear propulsion, so neither needs to visit a port for fuel, ever. But that's where the similarity ends, because the endurance of the reactor cores tells a completely different story. The Nimitz-Class is powered by 2 A4W pressurized water reactors. The A stands for aircraft carrier, 4 for the 4th generation design, and W for Westinghouse, the manufacturer. Each reactor core contains highly enriched uranium fuel configured in a geometry specifically designed for long-life operation. These cores are rated for approximately 25 years of continuous operation before requiring replacement, roughly 1.3 million nautical miles of steaming. When a Nimitz carrier reaches its midlife point, it undergoes a refueling and complex overhaul, or RCOH, at Newport News. This is a 4 to 5 year process that replaces both reactor cores, modernizes combat systems, refurbishes the flight deck and catapults, and essentially resets the ship for another 25 years of service. It costs approximately $4 to $5 billion, nearly the price of a brand new Charles de Gaulle. The Charles de Gaulle uses 2 K-15 pressurized water reactors, the same compact design originally developed for the French Triomphant-class ballistic missile submarines. The K-15 cores are much smaller and use lower enrichment fuel optimized for a different design philosophy. They require refueling every 7.5 years, or roughly once per decade of operational use when you account for maintenance cycles. That's about 1/3 of the Nimitz core life. The shorter refueling cycle is by design. It allows the French Navy to incorporate reactor technology upgrades more frequently and aligns with the ship's major maintenance schedule. But the operational impact is real. Over a 50-year service life, the Charles de Gaulle will undergo 6 to 7 refueling periods, each taking the ship offline for 18 to 24 months. A Nimitz undergoes only 1 RCOH in that same time frame. Now, for continuous at-sea operations without a port visit, both carriers are limited by the same factors: food supplies for the crew, jet fuel for the aircraft, ordnance magazines, and, most critically, human endurance. A carrier crew can sustain high-tempo flight operations for about 45 to 90 days before combat effectiveness begins to degrade from fatigue. At that point, the ship needs a port visit or an underway replenishment to resupply and give the crew a break. The nuclear propulsion is never the bottleneck. It's the humans, the logistics, and the consumables that force a carrier to seek a port. In this regard, the Nimitz and the Charles de Gaulle are remarkably similar. The difference is strategic, not tactical. The Nimitz core lasts so long that reactor availability is never a concern for deployment planning. For the Charles de Gaulle, the 7-year refueling clock is always ticking in the background. At the heart of every nuclear carrier is the reactor compartment, And the difference here is massive. The Nimitz-Class's two A4W reactors produce approximately 194 megawatts of thermal output combined. That thermal energy is converted by 4 steam turbine generators into 260,000 shaft horsepower, transmitted through 4 propeller shafts, each shaft driving a 5-bladed bronze propeller weighing over 30 tons. This power plant pushes roughly 100,000 tons of steel, aircraft, and crew through the water at speeds exceeding 30 knots. The exact top speed remains classified, but carrier crews have reported bursts above 33 knots during sea trials. What's remarkable is the acceleration. A Nimitz can go from a dead stop to full speed in minutes, not hours. The 260,000 shaft horsepower output makes it one of the most powerful propulsion systems ever installed on a non-icebreaker vessel. The Charles de Gaulle's 2 K-15 reactors produce about 150 megawatts of thermal output, roughly 77% of a Nimitz. This drives only 2 steam turbines, generating 83,000 shaft horsepower, transmitted through 2 propeller shafts. Top speed is approximately 27 knots. The power-to-weight comparison tells an interesting story. The Nimitz achieves about 2.6 shaft horsepower per ton of displacement. The Charles de Gaulle achieves roughly 1.95 shaft horsepower per ton. The American carrier is about 33% more powerful relative to its size. But raw propulsion is only part of the picture. What truly separates these two platforms is electrical generation capacity. The ability to power combat systems, sensors, computing infrastructure, and future weapons. The Nimitz-Class was designed with generous electrical margins, which is why these ships have been able to accommodate decades of electronics upgrades without major power plant modifications. The Charles de Gaulle runs closer to its electrical ceiling. When the ship was designed in the 1980s, nobody anticipated the power demands of modern phased array radars, electronic warfare suites, and networked combat systems. This is why the new Ford-class boosted its reactor output by roughly 250% compared to the Nimitz. Modern naval warfare is increasingly an electricity game. Sensors, jammers, directed energy weapons, and automated systems all compete for the same electrical budget. On the Nimitz, there's still headroom. On the Charles de Gaulle, the margins are thinner, and that constrains how much new capability France can add to an already 25-year-old hull. Let's talk about the bill that arrives every single year, whether the ship leaves port or not. The annual operating cost for a Nimitz-class carrier, and I'm talking about the ship alone, without the air wing, ranges from $1.3 to $1.5 billion per year, according to U.S. Government Accountability Office reports. Break that down. Approximately $3.5 to $4 million per day, or roughly $250,000 per hour, around the clock, 365 days a year. Where does that money go? Personnel is the largest single expense. A Nimitz has a crew of approximately 5,000 sailors and officers, enough to populate a small town. You're paying salaries, healthcare, food service, providing over 14,000 meals daily, training programs, and career development for every one of them. Then comes maintenance. The steam catapults require constant upkeep. The 4 arresting gear engines need regular overhaul. The nuclear reactor department demands highly specialized civilian and military technicians whose compensation reflects the scarcity of their skills. Logistics add another major layer. The ship consumes thousands of tons of jet fuel, ordnance, spare parts, and consumables every year, all of which must be procured, transported, and loaded. When you add the air wing, whose F/A-18 Super Hornets cost roughly $10,000 per flight hour, and F-35C Lightning IIs closer to $30,000 per flight hour, and the escort ships of a full carrier strike group, the daily operating cost for the complete formation reaches approximately $8 million per day, or roughly $2.5 to $3 billion per year for a deployed CSG. The Charles de Gaulle operates at a significantly lower absolute cost, estimated at approximately $250 million per year for the ship and its embarked air group. That breaks down to about $685,000 per day, or $27,000 per hour. The crew is roughly 1,950 personnel, including the air group, less than 40% of a Nimitz crew. The smaller air wing means fewer flight hours, less jet fuel consumed, and a proportionally smaller logistics footprint. But relative cost tells a revealing story. The Charles de Gaulle costs about $5,900 per ton per year to operate, while the Nimitz costs roughly $13,000 to $15,000 per ton per year. The French carrier is substantially more cost-efficient per unit of warship. Much of this efficiency comes from necessity. France operates a single carrier, so every euro must count. The US operates 10 Nimitz-Class carriers, and the sheer scale of the enterprise inflates overhead costs across the entire carrier fleet. Here's the uncomfortable reality. The annual operating cost of just one Nimitz-Class carrier, $1.5 billion, exceeds the entire annual defense budget of many nations. For the US, that's the price of maintaining the ability to strike any target on Earth within 24 hours. For France, $250 million per year buys a more modest but equally real capability: the ability to lead multinational naval operations and project French sovereign power from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Both investments deliver what their governments demand. Whether either is a good deal depends entirely on what you think a navy is for. Let's settle the size question with cold, hard numbers, and the difference is staggering. The Nimitz-Class displaces approximately 100,000 to 106,000 tons fully loaded, depending on the specific ship and its configuration. Length: 332.8 meters from bow to stern. If you stood it on end, it would reach higher than the Eiffel Tower. Beam: 76.8 meters at the widest point of the flight deck, which provides a 4.5-acre landing area. Draft: 11.3 meters below the waterline. The flight deck alone covers 1.8 hectares, larger than 3 football fields laid side by side. The Charles de Gaulle displaces about 42,500 tons fully loaded. Length: 261.5 meters, making it 71 meters shorter than a Nimitz, which is roughly the length of a Boeing 747. Beam: 64.4 meters at the flight deck. Draft: 9.4 meters. To put the size gap in visual terms, you could park the Charles de Gaulle on the flight deck of a Nimitz lengthwise, with 70 meters to spare. The Nimitz simply operates in a different physical category. It's not just bigger, it's more than twice the displacement, with all the volume that implies for hangar space, magazine depth, fuel bunkerage, crew accommodations, and damage control redundancy. Now, weapons. Here's where conventional comparisons can mislead you. The Charles de Gaulle carries 4 Silver A-43 vertical launch cells, housing 32 Aster-15 surface-to-air missiles for medium-range air defense, supplemented by 2 Sadral 6-cell launchers for Mistral short-range infrared guided missiles, plus several 20mm automatic cannons for close-in defense. Total missile count? Approximately 44. The Nimitz-Class is equipped with 2 or 3 Mark 29 launchers for RIM-162 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, 8 missiles per launcher, plus 3 or 4 Phalanx CIWS 20mm Gatling guns, firing 4,500 rounds per minute for last-ditch missile defense, and RIM-116 rolling airframe missile launchers. Combined missile inventory, roughly 48 ESSMs plus RAMs, arranged in a layered defense. But here's what you need to understand. Neither carrier is designed to fight its own air defense battle. Both operate at the center of a multi-layered carrier strike group, where Aegis-equipped destroyers and cruisers carrying SM-2 and SM-6 missiles provide the primary air defense umbrella, extending hundreds of kilometers. The carrier's own weapons are the inner layer, the last line of defense for threats that penetrate the escorts. This is true for both navies. The real weapon of any carrier, the reason these ships exist, is the embarked air wing. And here, the gap is definitive. The Nimitz carries 60-plus strike fighters, dedicated electronic attack aircraft, and airborne early warning platforms. The Charles de Gaulle carries 30 strike fighters, with no dedicated electronic attack squadron. The offensive punch, measured in bombs on target per day, tilts approximately 3-to-1 in favor of the Nimitz. Size gives you capacity. Capacity gives you sortie generation. Sortie generation wins naval battles. The Nimitz is larger because American naval strategy demands it be larger. The Charles de Gaulle is smaller because French strategy optimized for a different set of missions. Size isn't inherently better, but in carrier warfare, it certainly helps. So what have we learned? The Nimitz-Class dominates the Charles de Gaulle in every measurable category. It's bigger, it carries more than double the aircraft, it launches 3 times as many sorties per hour. Its reactors last 3 times longer between refueling. It produces more power. And all of this comes at a cost roughly 6 times higher annual operating expenses and more than double the build cost. But a straight comparison misses the strategic reality. The United States needs supercarriers because it maintains global commitments across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. France needs the Charles de Gaulle to project power in its sphere of influence, the Mediterranean, West Africa, the Middle East. Different missions demand different tools. The Charles de Gaulle is not a failed Nimitz. It's a successful French carrier purpose-built for French strategic needs. The Nimitz-Class is a successful American supercarrier purpose-built for American strategic needs. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a like and subscribe for more comparison content. See you in the next one.